Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Week in Review for March 17, 2024. Today we're talking with Arthur Martirosyan. Hello, Arthur. Welcome to the show.
Love to, Arthur.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you here. Before we get started, we'd like to remind you to support us and help us expand our reach. Please go to our donate page, podcasts.groong.org/donate, and give. Thanks in advance.
Well, let's quickly do a recap of our interview with the Canadian ambassador last week. Arthur, Asbed and I did a lengthy interview with the Canadian ambassador, Andrew Turner, last week on Groong. It was probably the most comprehensive interview with the ambassador so far. For those who want to listen to the hour-long interview, just look up episode 316 on your YouTube, Spotify, or any other channel where Groong exists. Asbed, given that the interview is still fresh on our minds, and Arthur appears to also have listened to it, I wanted to see if we could reflect a little bit on what was communicated. Canada is a major country, part of the G20, and has a significant Armenian diaspora, and the orientation of Canada vis-a-vis Armenia is therefore very important. Just for reference, we covered multiple topics in the interview, including the motivation for opening the embassy, EU monitoring mission in Armenia, of which Canada is a part of, and the issue of political prisoners in Armenia, as well as Canadian military supplies to Turkey. So maybe I can begin with you, Asbed. What are your thoughts on how the interview went in general?
Well, I was pleased to get the ambassador for all the time and the questions we wanted to ask. So in case he's listening, I want him to know that we are thankful for that. For me, Hovik, one of the moments I remember most is when I asked the ambassador who the EUMA, the EU Observer Mission, is protecting Armenia from. Who's the enemy, I asked. And I was looking for him to state clearly that they were protecting Armenia from Azerbaijan and that Azerbaijan was the enemy. And I felt that he ducked that question. And I guess that's what diplomats do. He said the conflict. They were protecting us from further conflict. And somewhere further during our interview, I recall that he said Azerbaijan was the enemy, but that was not in the context of my question. So I felt that Mr. Turner kept the line of Western both-sidism because they continue to need Azerbaijan's cooperation in the 21st century reprise of the Great Game or something like that. I mean, I don't doubt his sympathy with the Armenian people. I just think that not holding dictators and rogue states accountable for their horrible actions has only led to further horrors down history. One more thing, Hovik. The ambassador's response reminded me of how Pashinyan rejected the CSTO mission of observers because the CSTO would not make a clear statement labeling Azerbaijan to be the aggressor. So we have a situation that both the West and the Russians will not hold Azerbaijan accountable for its terroristic and criminal behavior. And I guess, Aliyev and Turkey are playing all these sides to their maximum benefit and at our expense.
Right. Yes, indeed. Well, I share that sentiment, and we are thankful that the ambassador agreed to come on. Arthur, what are your thoughts? Did you listen to the interview, and what are your takeaways from that?
Well, yes, I did. It's obviously a good thing when ambassador is open to participate in programs like this and talk about the mission, the goals, and the objectives, and why they're in the country. What has changed, why now they've decided to open an embassy and whatnot. And yet I didn't find anything really path-breaking in what he was saying. This is, he obviously avoided any name-calling, calling the spade a spade. He really avoided using the terms of ethnic cleansing. I cannot imagine what would be a reaction in Canada if one of the First Nations, or some of the First Nations, 120,000 of them, decided to leave the place, right? Let's put it that way. I mean, yes. They decide to leave Canada, 120,000 people. What would happen in that democracy and that? Obviously they understand it's ethnic cleansing, but they have interests and they are working with their interests. And one of the biggest interests right now is to multiply the voices of Western support of Armenia. How much they're going to go beyond rhetoric, that's a separate issue. And they do that by supporting Pashinyan's regime and calling it democracy. The ambassador can check the latest ranking by the Economist Group, 23. Armenia even has dropped in that ranking. It's now 84th in the world, I think 160 plus countries, 167 countries. And that indicates that even it's worsening, right? And most importantly, the Economist does not even put it in the category of democracies. We're in a group of countries known with the hybrid regimes. Why? Because democracy is not decided by just two elections that you conducted using the system developed by the previous regime, right? That allows you with 50% or lower than 50% turnout, get half of that, and that should be enough for you to monopolize. One party monopolizes all three branches of power in Armenia. This has nothing to do with democracy. This has nothing to do with the representative or Westminster democracy that the ambassador was representing. What's missing here, obviously, I mean, I'm not going to go into an academic debate here with the ambassador, kind of in his absence, but what's missing here is, as a student of Sam Huntington and Bob Dahl, I can tell him what's the real missing piece. I mean, Nazi Germany, too, was elected. And that's why Sam Huntington, in 93, I think, in his seminal work, The Third Wave, he described what else is necessary for a regime to qualify as democracy. It's not just fair and free elections. It's the ability of the country to go to the opposition.
Right.
Right?
And we've had one party rule for 4.5 years at this point, because of the supermajority in the parliament. There's been absolutely no recourse to anything that civil contract is able to do.
And I think a very astute observer of Armenian politics would understand why the so-called revolutionaries, once they came to power, they left the previous electoral code and the system in place. Because that system allows someone who controls the administrative resource and its networks and its cronies and nepotism to really have the minimum 700,000 votes at any elections. And if you lower the turnout, and it's possible to lower the turnout, that should be enough for you to garner half of the votes. And with half of the votes, you then have the supermajority, constitutional majority. That is the majority that can enact even laws that require constitutional court review. So this is something that is happening, and they cannot tell us that this is democratic. But they do. Right. And if they do, there is a question why. Because the more Pakistan is taking anti-Russian stance, the more they are sending him commendations of how democratic he is. But even worse, because the system now is less than Republican, definitely not Republican. Because in a republic, you would see the system of checks and balances. You'd see the three major branches separated, independent of each other. We don't have any of that. We don't have any of that. Yeah. Yes, the ambassador is new. Let's give him credit. Maybe he hasn't had the time really to see what's happening politically in Armenia. But I have my doubt that's the case.
He did, in fact, say that the embassy is still ramping up. So they have a lot of infrastructure to put in place. Hovik, I wanted to get your take on the ambassador's response to political prisoners, because I asked if Canada recognizes that there are political prisoners here. Diplomat Speak took over, and he kind of ducked that question.
Yes, indeed. And, we talked about two political prisoners, Armen Grigoryan, who actually died in jail for something he spoke. And we also talked about Armen Ashotyan, who is a clear political opponent of Pashinyan, and Ashotyan is in jail on a corruption case that is almost, if not already, near the statute of limitations. But you would only have to look at the circumstances in which Ashotyan is being held, which is severe limits on his visitation rights with his family, I believe, once a week or so, and no one else. He cannot visit anyone, except visitors from anyone else. And meanwhile, we have the now former Minister of Economy also being investigated on a corruption case, and he is, in home arrest. So it is clear to me that there is selective punishment, and the current government is trying to use soft methods, which is like sort of pretrial detention to punish people. And by the time, let's say, this case goes to the European Court of Human Rights, it's already, oh, well, he's out, so it's already a moot point. So I think that's it's a very sly trick that they're using, but doesn't pass the smell test. And, yes, I have to echo Arthur's concern about this. With all due respect, I do appreciate that Canada has opened an embassy. I do wish that Armenian and Canadian relations flower, but they have to be based on a grounded understanding of what the truth is. And simply paying lip service to democracy is, when all these injustices are happening, is not right. Armenia has basically, according to Freedom House in 2023, has downgraded into partly free status. That is the same status that was under Robert Kocharyan and Sir Sarkisyan. And, there's evidence that these organizations such as Freedom House are essentially heavily biasing their reports for political purposes. In fact, I would point people to an interview by this program called Red Thread of Arthur Martirosyan, who actually is the author of Armenia's Freedom on the Net reports by Freedom House. And he describes there, his difficulty in trying to get some text in the report that was contrary to this speak about democracy and Armenia embracing democracy. This is the government. Nikol Pashinyan's government is the government that banned free speech until it had to stop. I could only imagine what would happen if some of the formers had tried to do that. In fact, some of the formers decriminalized free speech, and he criminalized it. And what's funny is he criminalized only speech targeting elected officials and not anyone else, who are supposed to be protected more. There are so many more examples I could bring, but I would urge that our foreign diplomats, our foreign dignitaries, when they talk about democracy in Armenia, I think it's very easy nowadays to see that there's a big discrepancy between that talk and the reality. And if they really want to help Armenia, they should be honest about the state of democracy in Armenia.
Now, I would just echo what I heard from Hovik. You are not doing democracy service if you are condoning all these violations. In fact, I think the level of disenfranchisement, the people are getting more and more frustrated with and apathetic to the notion of democracy itself. And as we speak, there were elections in Azerbaijan, elections in Russia, just wrapped it up, I think, yesterday. The question will be, will the world then be choosing where they recognize these elections only based on the criteria whether you are in our camp or not? And that's not fair. We do not need democracy for someone else to come and tell us that it's democracy. Yeah. We need a democracy as a nation, as a people, because it's the best and the most efficient way to govern. And unfortunately, in 30 years, we haven't been able to come close. And the highest hope of 2018 that many had, that there will be finally a new system in place that would allow higher participation, including of diasporans, more vibrant politics, and lots of voices heard. And when the voices are not heard, people exit. So there is either your voice is heard or you exit. And right now, as I said, the quality of representative democracy, if you walk in the streets of Yerevan today and ask people who is representing their interests in that parliament, they won't be able to tell you. They won't be able to tell you who is representing their interests.
And that's even more important because after 2017, Armenia is a parliamentary nation. And right. we just did a episode 317 with Hrant Mikhailian, where essentially the Armenian National Assembly has the lowest trust in terms of institutions, whereas in a parliamentary country, it's supposed to be the opposite.
It's supposed to be the source of trust.
Yeah.
I also wanted to turn to this more critical, probably, issue right now for the country. The ambassador from the very beginning said that, there is no relationship between security and democracy. Let's not connect these two things, because quite a few Armenians have thought that it was democracy that weakened us and allowed authoritarian Azerbaijan to prevail. Right? It's a common kind of take. I would not agree with that because there are many studies in the field of IR on how different types of regimes have fared in war against each other. And I don't think it's fair to say that it was because of democracy that Armenia really was not able. But if you have an authoritarian regime and it's facing a regime that is not stable, right? It's neither authoritarian nor democratic, hybrid, just as the Economist has placed Armenia in its ranking, right? Hybrid. We don't know in this way. It is worse than two authoritarian regimes facing each other. Obviously, it's worse than democratic regime facing authoritarian. And the obvious advantage that democracies have is they are able to mobilize people in an honest process of mobilizations, unlike authoritarians who shove them in or take them in the streets to go and fight. But again, more critical for me was the security part of the conversation with the ambassador, because I know that there are so many in Yerevan now talking about the change of paradigm, Russians out, the West in. I didn't hear the ambassador say that openly. It's almost like they are adding more voices, right? I mean, more Westerners are talking about it. It's the talk of the town. Now also Canadians are talking about it. Now we're going to have the Swedes. Now we're going to have the Brits. Everybody is talking. And there is only Russians, right, who have to address this. So the more voices about the change, and people are often, I think, confused about these issues. We have part of the elite that is not really trained is incompetent, even in very critical positions of the government, incompetent on issues of security. And yet they are the ones who are taking the shots right now. And they believe that by switching the sides or escalating it with Russia, I noted that Pashinyan was not among those who celebrated, although that's a pro forma, a protocol thing, right? Elections are over in Russia. They're congratulating the leader for being reelected or whatever. There is no, I mean, maybe there is. I mean, I haven't seen. I haven't seen it in the Russian news feed. I haven't seen it in the Armenian news feed, right? So they are trying to capitalize on this anti-Russian stance. They understand that's what is going to bring more support, and that support they want to materialize, right, from the West. Okay, Canadians, see, and it's really dangerous and precarious because Pashinyan, I think, just the other day on in his longer than 3 hours interview, was talking about things that are really I don't know. I didn't even know how to react.
Go
to
ahead
that.
and say it.
Well, I mean, he said, for instance, that Russians, I mean, I'm not quoting, I will try to stay as close to what I heard him say, that Russians did everything possible to have Artsakh Armenians deported or leave so that they can come to Yerevan and create a rebellion against him and his regime, his government.
Wow. Yeah.
This is nonsense. I mean, but he's saying that. He's saying that. And it's not like, I mean, Russians are not following what he's saying, right?
And his mouthpieces are on the media every day saying, like, Russia is begging Erdogan to attack, and it is a very dangerous rhetoric, in my opinion, and completely not based in facts.
I don't think Russians are going to overreact to those things. They have too many other instruments to make it very painful for Armenia. Unfortunately, not for Pashinyan himself, but for Armenia, make it very painful for Armenia. That's what makes this whole thing.
Yeah.
I'm not saying Russia is easy to handle diplomatically or anywhere, but if you cannot, and you came to power in 2018 by promising to have brilliant relations, and then you've been talking about the best relations ever with Russia, right? Even in post-2022 war period, you were talking about that. And then all of a sudden, things started to collapse. And there is a question, why? What happened? Russians got worse than they were. But I think it's more incompetence than anything. They simply don't know how to work with Russians. And they have their biases, preferences, but they simply do not know how to work with them.
Arthur, thank you very much for bringing that context of democracy versus security, or democracy and security, because that also absolutely stuck in my
Asbed,
head.
I just want to give you a few quotes that I just looked up before the show. One of them is, security is the indispensable foundation of liberty. That was spoken by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Another one, without security, there can be no freedom. Ronald Reagan.
So can I close out this section with a thought from what the ambassador's background is. He said that he had formerly served in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and finally Eastern Europe and Eurasia, which I think also handles Ukraine. If you recall, U.S. Ambassador Christina Quinn also came from a previous assignment in Ukraine. And these are not just troubled spots. These are war-torn and ravaged spots. So my brain was racing about that. And I was thinking about what the situation in Armenia is or could be. And finally, as our previous U.S. Ambassador Lynn Tracy went to Russia, I was thinking maybe I should go to Vegas and put some money down on Ambassador Turner going to Russia for his next assignment after Armenia. What do you guys think?
Well, I think he still has a lot of time in Armenia, and let's hope that we are an exception on the ambassador's resume in terms of conflict areas.
Yeah.
Well, on a more serious note, I'd say this competition between the Western camp and, I say, Western civilization and Russia is very dangerous. And yet, the uncouth and incompetent Armenian policymakers, especially from the security realm, they are making it unnecessarily even more precarious for Armenia. And that's a really, really risky game that Pashinyan is playing. And he's gambling on the outcome of the war in Ukraine, but he's itching, right? He's itching. He wants also to start getting some dividends from the anti-Russian position. But the more anti-Russian position he's taking, before they even give him the carrot, they're asking him to make one extra step, right? The Rome stated, yes, great, but can you do this? Can you do this? And every time he's making even more absurd moves, provocative even moves to Russians. Well, I don't know. I think we'll need to, at some point, look back at what happened. Obviously, he continues to blame the previous regimes for what happened in Artsakh and Karabakh, and is trying to avoid any responsibility for what happened. The question is, would democratic state like Canada tolerate a leader who has made these many mistakes in 6 years? And Pashinyan keeps saying, I'm not going to retire once again just because you don't like what I'm doing. But, the cynicism of it is that when he was being reelected in 21, he made not only the promises that he's not delivering, but he never said things that he was going to do that he's doing now. And his gamble is, again, on the outcome of the war in Ukraine, but also he wants to make sure that he can cut a deal with Aliyev, cut a deal with Turks, do whatever they're asking. And they're not even asking, but demanding, because it's obvious that the 4 villages in Tavush, that was a precondition to continue negotiations. And he, again, caved in, right?
And on that note, I think we have a set of questions about that. So let's move to that topic if we can. This government uses manipulative language, saying that no territory that belongs to the Republic of Armenia will be handed over to Azerbaijan. Of course, they don't mention the second part, that they consider those villages Azerbaijani anyway. And they're essentially clearly saying now that they plan to give those villages to Azerbaijan. One major problem is that when you go from Iran to Georgia, the main strategic communications artery that you use passes right through those villages. In fact, based on Google Maps, you would enter and exit Azerbaijan 5 times going through that artery. On top of that, the main part of the Russian gas pipeline goes through those territories that Pashinyan intends to hand over. This brings up horrible nightmares similar to the Goris-Kapan fiasco all over again. When Armenia claimed that nothing was being handed over, then officially Pashinyan recognized a few villages along the Goris-Kapan highway as Azeri, using names like Ayvazli and Chayzami. Then Azerbaijanis put up signs on that road. Then one fine day, we have a checkpoint on that road. Then Azerbaijanis started charging customs duty for Iranian trucks while allowing Armenians to pass through with peacekeeper escort. And then one final day, they just closed it up completely. We also remember what happens when Azerbaijan gets control of roads under which there is critical infrastructure, such as gas pipelines. See the Lachin corridor for reference. So according to Shahin Mustafayev, this is the negotiating party from Azerbaijan who is doing the negotiation for the demarcation delimitation. All of these villages are planned to be given to Azerbaijan before the actual delimitation process begins, or else. In fact, Mirzoyan confirmed that Azerbaijan intends to give up nothing in exchange. None of the Armenian territories that they currently occupy, nor does it plan to agree on terms for the delimitation process based on maps that Armenia is putting forward. Arthur, the delimitation and demarcation process can be called one large negotiation. Well, in general, but have you ever seen a negotiation where one of the parties gives so many concessions before the negotiations even begin?
I haven't seen quite anything that I could compare in international negotiations where you are making concessions and then the other side would squeeze even more concessions and then would come back and squeeze even more concessions, and you'd be giving more and more and more in that short of space of time, right? I mean, we're talking about less
it's
than,
hard to call this negotiations.
yeah, this is not negotiation. This is really concessions, one-sided concessions. It's like the other side is saying, do this or else the military, right? Or else you will be hearing Azerbaijani military. And the Armenian side says, okay. They're trying to drag time, give some more, and then give some more. And this whole strategy that they have taken, obviously, I mean, we could say we do not know how ill-prepared maybe Armenia is for a war. But the problem is that it's been 4 years now after the war. And if you are not preparing for your next war, that's exactly what the other side is going to be doing. And this is exactly what I've been warning about, that Armenia is driven to this situation that will allow the other side to squeeze out more concessions without necessarily the need to go to a war. That's why when they were asking me, is there going to be a war? Is there going to be a war? I was saying, no. If I'm putting myself in the shoes of Aliyev, why would he go to war if he's going to get what he wants without a single shot? There is no, I mean, he can talk about the war. He can show the muscle. He can do things, but he doesn't need to go to war because he has a counterpart, an Armenian counterpart, willing to give more and more and more until he gets all that he wants. And what does he want? He wants to make sure that for decades, for centuries, this is a closed issue. Armenians are never gonna think about a revanche, number one. Number two, with the configuration of the territory, Armenia is going to be so dependent on Turkey and Azerbaijan that they will never, ever bring back to the agenda the issue of the genocide, Karabakh, and so forth. They will be happy users of Azerbaijani gas. And we even know who those people will be. Number three goal of Azerbaijan here is obviously to make sure that no competitive force in Armenia comes to power and replaces Pashinyan, because Pashinyan is doing exactly what they need. And unfortunately, I mean, the population in Armenia, fearing the war, and this was one part of the manipulation, right? What else can we do? We'll give this small part, right? He's holding this contour of Armenia's map, and this is this small Artsakh. Okay, we'll give this. I mean, it's nothing. I mean, because this is what real Armenia is, right? I mean, I'm saving this. I'm giving small part, but I'm saving this, and not realizing what kind of a Armenia we're gonna get for the future Armenian generations. How much more dependent Armenia we're going to have in this region if we're going to have Armenia in this region. And this is what makes it really, really precarious. The not so much the threat of the war, not so much the war itself even, but using the threat of the war to squeeze, again, as many concessions as possible. Some of these concessions are not going to be easy to repay or to regain over many, many years. And the, this storytelling of Pashinyan, as long as we get peace, we will then create this powerful country that will be a very strong player in the region and will therefore go after its interests, its goals, if only because he is willing to make concessions even on the Armenian identity, not material ones, but the real identity issues like history, like memory, like who we exactly are. Because Azeris are trying to deny us presence in this area. We came from nowhere. We came here because Russians brought and settled us there. That's their narrative. And he is accepting that narrative.
Yeah. Well, he was supposed to achieve peace after dumping Karabakh, and that hasn't happened. So I don't know how he expects the next phase to achieve anything different if he's not doing anything different than conceding.
Should I also mention that during the 3.5 hour press conference, Pashinyan signaled another concession that he was willing to make. And he said that Armenia may be willing to withdraw its international legal claims against Azerbaijan based on the principle of reciprocity. The blockade of Artsakh is one of those claims, I believe. So to me, that seems like he would also be making a decision affecting the people of Artsakh, unilaterally. What are your thoughts about, this move? And I realize that he said it, so he thinks he can do it. I guess from a moral perspective, from a perspective of being elected as the leader of Armenians, can the leader of a country basically say, there was genocide, but we're going to ignore that essentially in courts if Azerbaijan is willing to drop all of its claims as well?
I think he is a very poor negotiator. His negotiation skill set comes from his background as a blackmail yellow journalist. When I can blackmail you, Hovik, and say, if you don't give this and this or pay me this and this, very bad articles are going to appear about you in my newspaper. That's he's as an international negotiator, he's not only incompetent, he's also very stubborn. He believes that what he knows or what he does is the only right way of doing it. And these two things are detrimental. I've seen international negotiators who have come without experience, willing to learn, and they have picked up. Their learning curve has been very steep, and they have improved over time. This is not going to be the case with Pashinyan. If we start to recall how many things as a negotiator he promised, remember he said, I will not negotiate until Artsakh are at the table. Said it's impossible. How does he see that possible to negotiate? That's not a negotiable issue right now. Never happened. Forget about it. I'm going to negotiate from my own point. But what is your point? Then he said that that point was the lowering the bar. Okay, so they lowered the bar for you, and you continue to negotiate that way. I mean, I'm going to go. There are so many things. Are they demanding maps for prisoners of war? He gives out the maps, gets nothing. The other side is watching you. Whenever you're negotiating, every move you make, everything you say and you don't say is registered there. And if there are professionals there, and I'm sure that there are professionals in Aliyev's entourage, they know him as their five fingers, right? They know how to play this guy. And they know how cowardly he can be. They know when to escalate the rhetoric, when to do something in the field to show that if not, then this is going to be the consequence. They know it, and that's how they are getting everything from him without, again, necessity to take it to the battlefield.
Arthur, last Wednesday, the EU Parliament passed a resolution that hailed Armenia's change of foreign policy and praised its effective freezing of participation in the CSTO. It also said that should Armenia desire candidate status for EU membership, we're not talking about EU membership, candidate status for EU membership, and it continues on the path to democratic reforms, the request for candidacy should be considered by the EU. There are reports that Pashinyan's government, of course, is planning to submit a membership bid before the end of 2024. So as expected, Pashinyan was very quick to welcome and praise the EU resolution. Now, in light of many countries recently reiterating that neither the US, nor the EU, nor France will do or can do anything to save Armenia in case of an Azeri or Turkish attack, it's not clear to me what this non-binding resolution will do for Armenia besides further pissing off Russia. And they are pissed. They just issued a warning that irreparable damage is being done to relations between the two countries.
Yeah, we can.
So can the Russian-Armenian relations be fixed at this point, Arthur?
Any relationship can be fixed, but to fix it, you need people who know how to work on that, right?
Yeah.
Not only they don't know how to, they don't. They are not willing to. Because as I said, their goal is to, the West is saying you are democratic, we recognize you, continue doing what you are doing in Armenia, excellent, good job. Why should we switching the sides? his nightmare, his only nightmare is if Russia wins in Ukraine. If Russia wins in Ukraine, and I mean, as a negotiator, I've been saying this all the time. I mean, I don't know who's going to win there.
Mm-hmm.
40 proposition, and it's switched now to 60 and maybe even 80 Russia, recognized by even Western military analysts who in the beginning were saying Russia has lost already. So there is this uncertainty, and had he more assurances that Russia is losing, I think he'd be more aggressively going in that direction. But he's with every move he's burning. I don't know what is being communicated from Moscow. We may not be even seeing the tip of the iceberg of the communication. It's not necessarily what we hear from Zakharova. But apparently, I mean, we can see that, right? I mean, even by these small signs, we can see that the relationship is getting to a point of beyond repair, right? Aliyev is there congratulating Putin. Pashinyan is not there. I'm not saying we should be running ahead.
Arthur, I have a quick comment about that. I wonder what was the time between the Electoral Commission in Turkey announcing Erdogan's victory and Pashinyan congratulating Erdogan and comparing that to the Putin congratulations eventually.
Thank you for reminding us that. It shows his willingness, right? Here I have, this is Pashinyan, I have evil Russia who wants me out and wants Armenia as part of its empire. And I have these Turks, and the West will guarantee that Turks do not eat us up. And if they are not going to eat us, I'll give them some small things. And then somehow the West and Azerbaijan and Turkey, we will somehow manage, right? If Georgians can manage, we will manage. The problem with that line of thinking is that if you cannot learn from your own mistakes, right? Going back to 1990, when in March 1990, things were really getting tough for us in Karabakh, really. And closer to 91, right? If there hadn't been the putsch in Moscow, I don't know how this whole thing could have ended. I mean, it was just sheer luck that we had then. This time, Turks and Azeris are going to need only a couple of hours. They will find 55 different reasons to justify why they needed to open up a corridor or do this or that, right? We know how they've done it. They've done that historically. But if you haven't learned from your own mistakes, if you're not learning from the mistakes of others, and Georgia and Ukraine, why not? Then I don't understand how you are taking the risk of leading a nation in a crisis like this one. And it is a crisis where you need to be much more flexible, much more goal-oriented, and your goal should be the national interests of Armenia, not just the political survival of your regime. And this is where we are. I mean, these guys, I think, don't care about what's going to happen as long as they're going to stay in power. In that same interview, 3 and 4 hour interview, half an hour interview, he was saying kind of angrily that we may quit and leave these people to their own devices, right? I think Armenian nation in a crisis can mobilize and can stop this what I would call identity and national catastrophe that Pashinyan and his clique are taking us to. So if they leave, it's going to be, even under the worst circumstances, it's going to be the best decision they're going to make.
Arthur, so what can the EU do for Armenia's security? Can Armenia shoot democracy bullets at Azerbaijan or throw resolutions at them, or what?
Now, look, I mean, they didn't adopt any sanctions when there was ethnic cleansing. They didn't do anything when there was even a decision by the court, international court. They're saying, oh, now it all changed. I mean, now that you have this contour of your country, it has changed. Now that we have EU observers and Canadians, it has all changed. Now, if Azerbaijan, and I think the ambassador mentioned that, if Azerbaijan dares to initiate an aggression, it's intolerable because in Ukraine it's intolerable what Russia is doing, and they're going to be sanctions. And our Minister of Foreign Affairs has been very open about that there will be sanctions against Azerbaijan. Wait a second. Azerbaijan has already occupied Armenian territory proper. So if you are telling me that territorial integrity is so dear to your heart, and you are bleeding over Ukrainian losses of territory, then why not act here? Why not act here? And if they are not acting on some of these things, they are also sending a signal to Baku and Ankara. They're not stupid. They are looking at it and saying what these guys are capable of. They're capable of making another round of statements. It all depends how we are satisfying their other priority and vital interests. And if we are the ones who are doing that, they could not care less. They would not care less. They would say, oh, oops, what did you expect, Armenia? We were helping you, but you were not really sending Russians out quickly enough for us. They will find, I mean, if it comes to finding a pretext why they haven't acted. And number one issue is European Union doesn't have any means of dealing with security issues other than sanctions that haven't worked in Russia, haven't worked anywhere else.
I mean, the hypocrisy and the uneven treatment really undermines trust in the foreign policy of the West. For the sake of time, I'm going to move to our final topic. We only have a few minutes, so let's go ahead. A month ago, we discussed the extensive campaign fraud committed by civil contract and Dikran Avinyan during the September 2023 Yerevan municipal elections, which was reported by Infocom.am. Now, all these bombshell allegations about fake campaign contributions were called unprecedented by Western watchdogs. And we were just talking about the West right now. And earlier this month, Pashinyan's handpicked prosecutor general, Anna Vartabedian, dismissed all these extensive investigative reports, saying that there's no evidence of financial irregularities. And then on the heels of that, pro-government outlets like CivilNet and Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, the international OCCRP, came up with their own investigative problems that they noticed with their campaign funding. So civil contracts' questionable campaign tactics have been exposed in the media before. What happened now? Is the Western-funded agencies just discovering that there's corruption in Armenia, or what do you think about this situation, Arthur?
Well, as I said, I mean, as long as Pashinyan is going to be saying and trumpeting anti-Russian positioning, they're going to condone even more egregious and flagrant violations by this regime. They could not care less. It's a game where a lot is at stake. And for some diplomats in Brussels or the United States, I was just reading the former ambassador plenipotentiary of Armenia, Edmond Marukian, right? All of a sudden he becomes an ambassador, and then he steps down and says, oh, we crossed the red line. And he's now complaining and is saying, Charles Michel, the hypocrite. Charles Michel, the hypocrite. And I'm saying, Charles Michel could not be where he is hadn't he been a hypocrite. But you are a hypocrite pretending that you never knew that he was a hypocrite. So my take is this. Again, a lot will be cleared over this summer, a lot more even be cleared in November when the US goes through elections. So we have an important year where some of the uncertainties, at least, or some of the fog will be dismissed. But the most dangerous part, again, is a regime that to survive, to stay in power, is ready to make any concessions, is ready to do anything that will go against the will of Armenians, whether that's strictly Armenians from that contour, that is citizens of Armenia, or it's more than that. And for me, it's more than that. It's a nation of 10 million spread all over, and yet claims that this 3 million part can decide on issues that touch on the identity of the rest of the 7 million who are outside of Armenia. And this is going to be unacceptable. And I don't think one day when they're going to retire. any regimes end, they're going to retire. And their retirement is not going to be an easy one for them.
Right.
It's time to think of how it's going to happen before that.
All right, that's all for today. It's time to see if there's something on your mind from this past week that you would like to share. Hovik?
Well, the only thing I would like to share is to remind our listeners that next week is going to be a very tough one. I believe in the next few weeks, it seems that the Azerbaijani government has been able to coerce interviews from our prisoners, the political military leadership of Artsakh in Baku. Arayik Harutyunyan has been shown, Levon Mnatsakhanyan, and others. And I think it's really important to be prepared for what you hear and to understand that anything that comes out of that is going to be under duress. God knows, the torture they're already going through, and it's important to realize essentially that they're being tortured essentially to do that. But please don't resist the urge to share these types of videos when they come out. I believe March 27th is when they are scheduled to be released, but I don't think it does us any good to share those videos, as well as just think about the potential coercion that they have received in order to agree to participate.
Arthur, any thoughts you would like to share?
Well, it's 150th anniversary of Russian philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev, early 20th century. And yes, we're dealing with Russia that we often is said it cannot be understood, right? It's beyond the reason. But I don't think so. I think reading someone like Berdyaev can explain many things about the Russian past, the present, and even future behavior. And one important piece here is going to be the formula that has always been there. And Berdyaev writes that not quite in those terms, but writes about the importance of that formula. And that is no unloyal regimes beyond my borders. That is, we are not going to tolerate regimes that are going to be conniving or conspiring with our enemies. Russia's advantage is its huge area, but it's also their curse. Again, I can be condemning or saying bad things about the Russian policy in the last couple of years, but the most important piece is you always understand who you're dealing with, and you understand what is at stake, what consequences might there be if you mishandle that relationship. And Pashinyan's government definitely has mishandled it.
Mm-hmm. I usually don't have a rant or rave, but something you said earlier, Arthur, got me thinking. You said Western culture versus the Russians in the current geopolitical winds. I really don't think it's a cultural thing, because look at Western culture and look at Russian culture. People listen to Beethoven or Benjamin Britten or Tchaikovsky, and there's no differentiation. They're the same culture. People all over the world, including the West, mandatory reading of the brothers Karamazov. Right. This is all Western culture. I believe that the current winds are all geopolitical, political, and having to do with money and national interests. And right now, it looks like Armenians are the biggest losers. All right. Good discussion as always. Thank you, Arthur, for your time.
Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
That was our Week in Review show recorded on March 18, 2024. We've been talking with Arthur G. Martirosyan, who is a senior consultant with CM Partners. In 1994, after graduating from Yale University, he joined Conflict Management Group and Harvard Negotiation Project, and has since worked on conflicts in the former Soviet Union, the Middle East, the Balkans, Africa, and Latin America. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And this is Hovik Manucharyan.
Please follow us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.